But I mean, it's really important to note that this is a lot of power, and to supplement this power, sort of, what do we need to do?
Great, and I think you make a very good point about the emerging markets, right? We're starting to see different areas come to light and consider their locations and their infrastructure to help support the demand in which these developers and groups are coming to them with profound interest in wanting to do projects. And um, as I was mentioning, the grid is exhausted, so supply is not meeting the demand. And if you add on the moratoriums, the delays, and the supply chain and logistical constraints, it just adds even more complexity to this ever growing equation. So a couple of key things that I wanted to highlight is specifically around like equipment delays. So we're seeing up to 20 to 30 weeks for equipment delays. Specifically, generators are looking at 72 to over 100 plus weeks for that equipment, and transformers alone are pushing over 120 weeks in some markets. So that is a long wait time, and this is just another factor that needs to be included within the equation to overcome and hurdle these obstacles that are coming our way. But it comes with a lot of preliminary planning and alignment to key stakeholders, your labor pool, your supply chain providers, not to mention your local jurisdiction. So anything else that you wanted to add onto that, Mehrbano?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, with demand surging so much, we also have to account for the fact that AI and data center infrastructure itself is also developing at the same rate. And we see that just in the last, I want to say, 5 to 7 years, we've seen a rehash of things like rack capacity and grid infrastructure, as well as just what actually goes into the data center. Most data center developers are looking for better redundancy to reduce downtime, and they're looking at racks that now consume, I think, 3 to 5 times more power than they initially did maybe a few years ago. And when that happens, you see that your markets start to become not only saturated, but we see a huge market migration, as we mentioned before, where Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona weren't primary markets just because Virginia is full, California is full. I mean, Texas has a lot of land, but people are migrating to secondary markets. And I think Chicago and Illinois just became a tier 3 market recently, as of I think last month, just because there's been so much traffic being driven outside of what we initially thought were just going to be our only data center hubs and hotspots. So we're seeing a lot of market migration. We're seeing a lot of supply chain constraints, as you said, and the timelines for all of these are just really, really developing very fast. And because it takes so long, 20 to 30 weeks was the initial for generators, which is now 72 to 105 weeks, and transformers can take up to 120 weeks to get delivered. And when that happens, to meet demand, we really see that folks need to innovate and sort of come up with different alternatives or quicker methods or more efficient methods to meet their demand. And I think not only that, I mean, external permitting is also such a setback in certain situations. We really have to keep in mind that you need to account for a multitude of factors when you're building a site. And that's something we'll definitely touch on later in more detail. But just the permits themselves, you need clean water. You need to make sure that you're either contributing to things like recycling the water, taking it from a water treatment plant, or you're not increasing your environmental emissions. And I think I want to talk a bit about the XAI example with you here, just because it highlights how important these permits are, and just not as far as data center operations are concerned, but in the larger scheme of community and in the larger scheme of scalability. But if you want to speak more to that example, go in a bit of detail, happy to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I actually wanted to highlight some trends that we're seeing really quickly, and then maybe we can pull back to the XI or
Yeah.
XAI example and talk a little bit about that, and some of the potential oversight that might have happened. But one of my favorite things that I've come across, and I'm sure most of you have come across as well, is a lot of the ingenuity that is happening with some of the challenges that are starting to take place within our space, and how we're overcoming them with just creative thinking. And Meta with their New Albany, Ohio project set up hurricane-proof tents. And when I saw this come across my LinkedIn feed, I was like, my jaw dropped. It hit the floor. I was like, what are we doing? This is interesting. I've never seen anything quite like this. But we have a number of groups starting to think outside the box, and think very critically around how they can deploy faster within their phased approaches. That specific campus in New Albany, Ohio, is a multi-campus phased approach. And while it is a potentially risky situation, I mean, it's showing groups like Meta are taking these unorthodox approaches and overcoming some of these timeline constraints so that they can deploy faster and be in front of their competition, be forward to the markets. And I'll also highlight really quickly, StarGate and their project in Abilene, Texas, is an 875-acre site, and that tract is actually bigger than New York City Central Park, if some of you guys didn't know that. And it has roughly 8 buildings with 102 gigawatts of power draw there. And they're tapping into natural gas infrastructure in Texas. So they have a fleet of natural gas generators. And they're calling this on-site, behind-the-meter gas-powered microgrid. So we'll talk about this microgrid architecture, and what groups are starting to do to have more resilience and less dependency on the power grid. But I'm just amazed about the bottlenecks amazed about how we're overcoming some of the bottlenecks that are within our space. So with that XAI deal, Mehrbano, let's talk a little bit more about that. So if you wanted to set the stage for everybody as to where that project is,
Yeah.
and some more
Yeah,
information about it,
absolutely.
we can lean into that one a little bit more, and then
Absolutely. Yeah. And just before I do that, I think, while we do see innovation as far as like meta data centers putting up those hurricane proof tents um, for their data centers, it's quick, it's efficient, it's somewhat safe, but we're also seeing the other end of it where, this XAI data center, it's in West Memphis. It's in Memphis, sorry, and Tennessee. And we see that they had gained the permitting for 15 gas turbines, but what ended up happening is that they actually ended up running 35 on the site without the permits that they needed to operate. And when we talk about things like scalability, sure, you need to meet your own demand. You need to, meet your own company's needs. But when this happens, the externalities sort of trickle out. And we see that Memphis itself, the area in which they have this data center, was already known for a really low API sort of index and air quality index. But the running of additional gas turbines has really changed the way that folks are looking at innovation and development in certain areas, because it's sort of like an opportunity cost there. You want to run your data center in a way that you have a lot of community support and push and no pushback. And that's definitely something I guess we'll talk about later. But just setting up the stage, the XAI has faced a lot of backlash. And I think they also got an F grade on their air quality, and don't align with the permitting that they had applied for. So when this happens, we see like two ends of the spectrum for data center innovation and development, and sort of what that means for things like scalability or dependency, or like just avoiding downtime.
yeah, that's a great point, Mehrbano. And I wanted to pull conversation back to XAI because traditionally behind the meter, you know, a lot of groups have looked at renewables as a more sustainable approach. And really within the conversations that I've been having recently, and that's really where our conversation is centered around today, is fast tracking those data centers with pending renewables, and a microgrid architecture that is leveraging projects that are in the interconnection queues that are either pending or approved. And if we don't have anything else further to add on this slide, maybe we can pivot over to a few examples in which we can show how we are doing some of the power associations and the great work that you and your team, Mehrbano, have deployed within the last several weeks to bring a lot of this data to our platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I just want to touch on Microsoft hydrogen fuel cells a little bit before we do that, just to give some additional context to how we're innovating very fast. And, Microsoft ran a test to see if they could run their data centers on hydrogen fuel for, I think, 48 hours. And while the company claims to be 100% carbon free, we see things that are called power matching, and we'll definitely come to that later in the different types of PPAs that these folks sign, like the power purchase agreements that they sign with energy developers, grid developers. But I think the most important trend that we are seeing is behind the meter projects and microgrid infrastructure, but mostly behind the meter projects are providing scalable, dependable solutions for these hyperscalers specifically to be able to not have to pull from already very saturated grid. And as you said, only 10% of the projects make it out to the active stage. And when that happens, I think it's really important for us to note, like, what is a reliable, low risk sort of way for us to get our power?